John Callaway Interviews.
Good evening. This evening we're going to be talking about the making of American history and about the life and times of one of the principal characters in the making of American history in recent years, Senator George McGovern, who is my guest this evening. Senator McGovern has just written an account of his life, an autobiography called Grassroots, published by Random House, a book I enjoyed very much. Senator McGovern was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1957, and he was elected to the U.S. Senate first in 1962, and as you know, he was the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States in 1972. Senator McGovern, why an autobiography at this time? What's its purpose?
Well, as I say in the preface of the book, John, I hope it's only a partial autobiography. I hope it doesn't mean my life is over. I'm 55 years of age now and in very good health, I think. I feel better now than I did 10 years ago. But I thought some of the things that had taken place in my life needed to be put down on paper before they started to fade in my memory. I didn't want to write about the 1972 campaign right after the election. It was frankly too painful. And also I thought I was incapable of really doing an objective account of it. There was so much emotion associated with the whole thing that I wanted to kind of let things simmer down and sort it out in my own mind, and yet I did want to get it down for future generations to read about someday. So it seemed to me that 5 or 6 years after the event was a good time to do it. But when I got into the 72 campaign and told the story about how I won the Democratic nomination, it didn't make sense to me without tracing back my origins in South Dakota and my days at Northwestern University and my days as a bomber pilot in World War II. So I thought, well, I'm just going to write a personal memoir about everything that's happened since I was born in 1922, and that's what this book is all about.
You told me you took 2.5 years to write it. You got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, would write until 8:30 or so. Now that you've written it, now that you've taken that time, do you feel any differently about your life than you did when you started?
Well, I do in this sense, John, that as we move along through life, sometimes it seems kind of chaotic. Events seem to develop that have very little relationship to what has happened before. But when I put myself through the discipline of telling the story of what has happened to me since I came onto this earth some 55 years ago, one of the things that struck me is that my life has a lot of continuity to it. One thing seems to follow and train rather logically from what had gone before. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but my life does seem to be one piece of cloth, one fabric, and I think that as one reads that book, or at least as I wrote it, it was clear that certain things were going to happen in view of the progression of my life from the very beginning. In one sense, the winning of the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972 probably could have been foreseen by some of the things that were taking place out in South Dakota and in my days as a graduate student here in Chicago. Some of the observations I made as a pilot in World War II, all of those things played their part in the eventual confluence of events that led me to become the Democratic presidential nominee in 1972.
Does the finishing of the book now and the recollections that you've had, the consolidating of feelings and facts and judgments and reflections, prepare you? Is it a step, an intellectual or a personal step at all, towards a new part of your life?
Yes, I think it is, in the sense that it's made me think about the things that are important, and also not to worry quite so much about the things that aren't important. I think I have a better perspective on what I want to use my time to accomplish over the next 10, 15, 20 years, whatever time I have left. There's something about the study of history itself, and I am a historian, and beyond that, looking at the history of one's own life, that enables you to approach problems in a little more patient and philosophical way. I would like to think that my judgments from here on out will be made thoughtfully, that they'll be made without any sense of panic, that I will recognize that a setback one day doesn't need to be fatal in terms of the future, and that life goes on. You can have defeats, you can have even crushing disappointments, and still the sun's going to come up the same place in the morning the next day, and life somehow goes on.
Senator McGovern, when you came out of World War II and you went back to Dakota Wesleyan and then later you went to Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston, you were at the juncture of a decision. Were you going to go into the ministry, or were you going to go into some other line of work? And of course it ended up being politics and government. But would it be fair if one were to view your surface defeats, for example in 1972, would it be fair maybe to say that finally you did become a minister?
Well, in the sense that a minister really dedicates his life to what he perceives to be the pursuit of the good. Maybe the pursuit of the best is putting it a little too strongly. It's always seemed to me just a little bit arrogant to talk about the best. But insofar as my life has been aimed at the pursuit of certain public good, certain good ends, I suppose in that sense I'm doing the same thing that a clergyman would be doing, in the sense that I like to think of my life as one devoted to public service, to the service of others. That's not too far removed from what one would be doing in full-time service in the church. So maybe I would agree with the suggestion of your question that, in a sense, I've been a minister all along.
Well, and I mean not just in the pastoral sense, but I mean it, I guess, more in the prophetic sense. Because if one wants to view you in short-term political terms, one could say he lost every state but one in 1972. The man's an abysmal failure.
Yes.
I mean, a pathetic figure in American history. And yet, if you want to look at what you were saying during that campaign, you could say there was the scripture, there was the prophecy, and that was your contribution,
well,
and that we ought not to forget about it.
John, I think maybe we need a new definition of winning and losing in politics. Adlai Stevenson of this state, the father of the present senator, was defeated twice for the presidency, and yet I don't think his life was a failure. I suppose I especially reject the notion that it was a failure and that he was the man who brought me into politics. It was really the eloquence and almost the poetry of Adlai Stevenson that inspired me to leave the classroom as a college history teacher and sign up as a full-time politician. So that I don't regard his setbacks in 1952 and 1956 really as failures. I think they prepared the way, for example, for John Kennedy to win in 1960. And for the next 20 years, Adlai Stevenson kind of set a standard by which other politicians were measured. In my own case, I don't claim to be an Adlai Stevenson. I don't claim to be anything else other than George McGovern. But I would say this to you, that although I lost heavily in 1972, I wouldn't trade places with the winner. If you could somehow say by pushing a button on this desk that I could become Richard Nixon, who was one of the biggest winners in presidential history, I wouldn't trade places with him. I'd rather be here as the man who lost in 72 than to be in San Clemente in the shoes of the man who won.
In your book, you say that you have loathed Richard Nixon since the day he entered the national political arena in 1946 carrying his red brush. How do you feel about him today?
Well, I guess now I feel sorry for him. I stood next to him at the funeral of Hubert Humphrey a couple of weeks ago, and he looked so sad and so overwhelmed by what has happened to him that I even felt some tinge of compassion towards him. He was there with his daughter, and I almost think he's become a an object of pity. But when I said in the book that I loathed Richard Nixon, what I was referring to is the way he had conducted his political campaigns. When he first ran for the Congress in 1946, he destroyed the reputation of one of the best people in the Congress, Jerry Voorhees. He painted him as a kind of a subversive and a pink and if not a pro-communist. He did the same thing with Helen Gahagan Douglas, who's a very distinguished woman, outstanding patriot, great American citizen, one of the finest women we've produced in this country, and Richard Nixon destroyed her by implying that she was a kind of a pink or socialist or communist, and all these innuendos. A very, very slick campaign that catapulted Richard Nixon into the Senate over the carcass of Helen Gahagan Douglas. And he did the same thing as a vice presidential contender in 52 and 56. He tried to cast aspersions on Adlai Stevenson, on his loyalty and on his integrity, his patriotism. Somehow, Richard Nixon, throughout his life, didn't seem to be content with defeating an opponent. He had to destroy them and discredit them and distort them. He'd never wanted to meet them on a candidate-to-candidate basis. I'll have to tell you that when I ran against him in 1972, I never saw him. I never even saw him from a mile away, let alone have the privilege of debating him in a network television studio, as John Kennedy did in 1960. There weren't any debates in 72.
That was the vacuum campaign.
It was a vacuum campaign. He wouldn't hold any press conferences. I think he held one.
I was going to say, you weren't the only one that didn't see him.
That's correct. And what we saw were these slick, paid television commercials that were manufactured out of that enormous campaign kitty he had. And so the voters saw a kind of a plastic, slick, marketed Richard Nixon, but they never saw any face-to-face debate between the two candidates.
Senator McGovern, when you consider what you were trying to say to the American people in 1972 and the overwhelming rejection of what you were saying, apparently, for Richard Nixon, how do you put that then up against the rhetoric that the Carter campaign was based on? And that is, if only the American people, if only the politicians will rise to the level of the character of the American people, we'll be okay. How do you put those two together, or do you?
Well, President Carter had certain things going for him, I think, that were not available to me in 1972. First of all, Jerry Ford did meet him in face-to-face debate, and I think that's to Ford's credit. They had 3 standoffs in nationally televised debates. Even the 2 vice presidential candidates debated. And the voters had a much better opportunity to examine the relative ability of the 2 men.
In other words, you don't necessarily blame the voters in 1972. Are you saying that you may share Carter's high opinion of the American people in their good sense?
I do. I don't blame the voters in 1972. I think they were misled. They never really did have an opportunity to examine the 2 candidates on a face-to-face basis. They tended to go along with the view that Nixon was an incumbent president with great experience, that he was ending the war in Vietnam, he was opening a new chapter with China, he was working on détente with the Soviet Union, he was selling American wheat and raising farm prices, and I understood why those things had great appeal to the American people. We were told that there was a new Nixon. He was more mature, more thoughtful, he was wiser. Kissinger was conducting a kind of a brilliant diplomacy in the Middle East, and it was a very appealing thing to the American people. So I don't hold any bitterness towards the voters in 1972. I think they made a very unwise decision. And no one would always contend that in a free society the voters always vote their best interests. One thing that has encouraged me is that by 1974, 2 years after the election, in every public opinion poll that was conducted, a majority of the American people said if they could vote over again, they would have repudiated Nixon in 72 and I would have been elected. So obviously I can't quarrel with their ultimate judgment and their ultimate wisdom.
One of the ultimate judgments that people are going to quarrel with you about is your interpretation of the Eagleton affair during the campaign of 1972, because you're saying in Grassroots that the Eagleton affair cost you that election. It cost you more than that election. It cost you possible political achievements in the future. And you say very candidly in your treatment of it that you made mistakes, that you should have prepared better, questioned better, etc. But in the same sentence, you give, if I'm not misinterpreting you, equal weight and equal criticism to the press of the United States. And I think that's where people are going to say, now, George, we know some of the headlines were pretty sensational, but come on now, don't try and equalize the blame. Give us 22.3 and you take 78.7.
Well, first, John, let me correct the impression you may have got there. I don't say that the Eagleton thing cost me the election. What I say is that probably no Democrat would have defeated Richard Nixon in 1972, George McGovern or anyone else. But if I had a chance to overcome the lead that he had in the polls, the Eagleton affair ended it. Whatever chance we might have had, and I've always recognized it was an uphill chance, we lost that opportunity to offset the odds because of the Eagleton affair. I think from the moment I picked Tom Eagleton, Richard Nixon was home free. There might have been a chance for an upset, and that ended it. But in all fairness, any Democrat running against Richard Nixon in 1972, if you were a smart odds maker, you'd put the odds on Nixon. He was, after all, the incumbent president, and the chances are he would have won if we'd have had the most perfect vice presidential candidate running with me. All I've said in the book is that any chance we had went out the window with Tom Eagleton.
All right, now take a minute, because I'm sure that many of our viewers are very interested in this, and they probably haven't had a chance to read this yet. And explain the process, the pressure, the thinking, whatever that occurred between the time you said, Tom, I'm 1,000% behind you, and the time a week later you had to reverse that process.
Let me tell you how we got into the 1,000% statement. When I first learned about Senator Eagleton's history of mental illness, there's no question it was severe. It was a terrific blow to me, and I think Tom Eagleton would say today that he made a great mistake in not telling me about it. Once we got the story from him, I said, well, Tom, let's do this. This has always been an open campaign. Let's go tell the whole story. Let's go ahead with this press conference, and you tell the press and the American people exactly what happened. And we'll see what the reaction is, see if we can ride it through. And he said, well, if you'll do that and we run into trouble, I'll step down. You won't have to say a thing to me. I'll step down today, next week, next month, any time up until Election Day if we run into trouble on it. Well, with that assurance, I decided to go ahead and to back him all the way, and then we would make a judgment if we had to at some point about the future of the ticket. The next day after that press conference, an Associated Press writer, Carl Lubsdorff, encountered me at the tennis court and said, what are you going to do, Senator, if this doesn't work out? I said, well, we'll just have to wait and see. That story showed up in the Washington Press under a headline, McGovern reconsidering Eagleton decision. And I was furious. That isn't what I said at all. I didn't say I was reconsidering it. I said, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. And so when my campaign manager called me and told me that's the way the story was being written, I said, you tell those people I'm backing Tom Eagleton 1,000%. I was furious to have my word questioned in that way. Now, that didn't get any attention. The 1,000% thing was carried way down at the bottom of the story, and nobody paid any attention to it except Tom Eagleton. And from that day on, every time he was asked about the incident, he said, well, Senator McGovern says he's backing me 1,000%. That's how it got on television. That's how it was given nationwide attention, because it was repeated over and over again by Senator Eagleton, who was trying to reassure people that he was going to be on that ticket to stay. But what happened is that there was a bad reaction around the country. Volunteers were quitting all over America. Our fundraisers were resigning. The whole campaign was centering around this controversy. And I warned Tom that we were going to have to reconsider the whole matter. But at that point, he had decided to fight it out and do whatever he could to stay on the ticket. I then started to call leading psychiatrists around the country. I talked to Dr. Menninger, and he said, Senator, you're in an impossible situation. There are just millions of people in this country who are not going to support that ticket if you have a man running with you with a long history of mental illness. On the other hand, if you ask him to step down, there are other millions of people who are going to turn against you for persecuting somebody who's had a history of mental illness. So no matter what you do, you're in a serious political problem. And it was only after I talked to Senator Eagleton's doctors about it that I decided the interest of the country required me to ask him to step down.
I think our Chicago viewers will be very interested in your various accounts of Mayor Richard J. Daley, and I think many of your supporters over the years in this city have been disappointed that you have not been more critical of him, and you are not more critical of him in this book. And I think you ought to say a word or two as to why that is so.
First of all, I've got to tell you that I liked Mayor Daley. I didn't always agree with his judgments. I did not want him driven out of the 1972 convention. I regret to this day that the delegates of that convention expelled him. I did my best to keep that from happening, but as you know, my delegates were very independent-minded men and women. They made their own judgment. They were angry about the challenge to our California victory, and they retaliated by expelling the Illinois delegation. But in spite of all of that, the minute I was nominated, Mayor Daley endorsed the ticket. He campaigned for me here in Illinois. We won Cook County. We carried the city of Chicago. And I can't forget that. He stood up for the ticket when others ran away. I just felt that while he did some things that I wouldn't have endorsed 100%, that he stood by the Democratic ticket. He stood by me personally. And I came out here when he died to express my respect for him and the things that he had accomplished for this city, and I make no apology for that.
When readers get to that section of your book, which the title really is based on, if they go back and see those wonderful stories about how you developed 40,000 3x5 cards, how you overcame the problem of the donkey at the state fair in North Dakota, they'll see probably a part of why you might have some political affection for Daley also, because both of you are kind of grassroots experts. You said at the beginning of this program, Senator McGovern, that after having finished this book, that you now, as you come into whatever it is, the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 years of your life, have a different set of priorities. One of the things I saw all the way through this book, and I think I was most touched by, was your treatment of the phenomenon of being a politician, governmental servant, and the neglect of family. And I saw writing about your wife and your children, which was apologetic, confessional, and deeply moving. Is that going to be one of your greater priorities?
It is indeed. I'm going to spend more time with my family, with my wife, with my children, with my grandchildren, and if public service has to suffer, well, so be it. I think I've given the people of South Dakota and the people of the United States a full measure at everything I've attempted to do, but there comes a time in your life when you have to correct some of the imbalances elsewhere. My family has paid a heavy price for the fact that I've been a public servant. A public servant means just that. It means that your first duty is to the public. But my children are still not so old that they don't need me. My grandchildren need me. My wife needs my support, and they're going to have it. And if I have to cut short some of the days at the office, cancel some of the speaking trips, I'm going to do it in order to try to repair what I think has been some of the neglect of my own personal family.
Could it be argued that the public servants who think that the public comes first and not family would serve the public better if their lives were more integrated?
I think they would. I think I might have been a better senator, maybe even a better presidential candidate, if I'd have been just a little bit closer to my daughters and to my son and to my family. All of them campaigned for me. They dropped everything they were doing and went all out for a period of about 2 years. And when I saw the way they were willing to set aside their own personal convenience in order to serve that campaign and in order to serve my political aspirations, it was doubly touching to me. And I made up my mind when that campaign was over that things were going to be different, and they have been the last 6 years. I have given more time to my family, and I think it's been to their benefit as well as to mine. And I don't think it's hurt my public service.
You said that Richard Nixon looked very sad at the funeral service for Senator Humphrey. What were your feelings? What are your recollections now on that man?
Well, I couldn't help but think as we were listening to all these tributes to Senator Humphrey, here was a man who desperately wanted to be president. I can remember Hubert talking about that 20 years ago. He was my next-door neighbor in Washington, incidentally, for about 10 years, and I used to ride to the Capitol with him almost every day during that period. But I agreed with the observation President Carter made in his eulogy that when you looked at all the people in that room, Richard Nixon, Jerry Ford, Carter himself, all the rest of us standing around there, while Hubert Humphrey never made the White House, he probably accomplished more in terms of changing the direction of the country, alerting us to the great issues of civil rights, economic justice, the needs of the unemployed, than most of the people who had achieved the White House.
There is a very beautiful little story in your book about Senator Humphrey's son, who came to you after you stood by in the principal guest box at the nomination ceremony in Chicago. After you'd had those bitter divisions with Senator Humphrey over Vietnam, you did stand by him.
Well, that's correct. In the '68 convention, I had not intended to be a presidential candidate, but when Robert Kennedy was shot, his supporters and his staff came to me and asked if I would head their delegation to the convention, and I did that. It was largely over the Vietnam issue, but once Hubert Humphrey was nominated, I clearly preferred him to Richard Nixon. So I went to the rostrum here in Chicago and stood with him, and while the applause was dying away and I was getting ready to leave the rostrum, Dougie Humphrey, Senator Humphrey's youngest son, said to me, George, thanks for standing with my dad tonight. And that reminded me that there are personal factors in politics that sometimes loom very large.
You going to run again?
I'm going to run for the Senate again in 1980.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Our guest, Senator George McGovern, whose new book, his autobiography, is called Grassroots. I'm John Callaway. Good night.